The rhythmic clinking of a rusted iron hammer hitting an old anvil echoed softly through the cramped, dusty junk shop. Sol wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead with the back of his grease-stained hand. Outside the wooden window frame, the small, mundane town of Oakhaven buzzed with quiet, everyday life. It had been exactly 10 years since humanity fell to the overwhelming armies of the Demon King. Few people now remembered the legendary hero who had lost everything in that final, catastrophic battle. Sol picked up a blunt, ordinary dagger and carefully began to grind its edge against a wet, spinning stone. His hands, though covered in manual labor scars, still possessed the muscle memory of the world's finest swordsman. A cheerful laugh suddenly broke the silence as a young girl with bright, curious eyes burst through the back door. Melo held up a perfectly round apple, her face beaming with pure, innocent joy. Sol smiled softly, setting his tools aside to welcome the orphan of his fallen commander. She was the ultimate secret he had sworn to protect, carrying the dangerous lineage of the legendary hero. Melo eagerly narrated her afternoon adventures in the marketplace while helping him stack old iron pipes. Suddenly, the heavy wooden front door of the shop was violently kicked open, rattling the glass panes. Two imposing figures clad in jagged dark iron armor stepped over the threshold, their demonic eyes gleaming red. Melo instinctively shrank back, gripping the fabric of Sol's worn canvas apron tightly. The lead demon patrol officer snarled, demanding the immediate payment of the monthly occupation tax. Sol bowed his head low, speaking in a deliberately meek, subservient tone to avoid suspicion. He reached into his pocket and handed over a small leather pouch filled with silver coins. The demon snatched the pouch, then looked past Sol, his sinister gaze locking directly onto Melo. The demon's magical detector ring suddenly flared with a bright, erratic golden light. The officer noted that the child's hidden biological resonance matched the prohibited bloodline of the hero faction. Melo staggered backward, her fear accidentally causing a tiny spark of golden holy aura to crackle around her fingertips. Realizing the immense value of their discovery, the two demons raised their heavy weapons to apprehend the girl. In that precise microsecond, the submissive aura surrounding Sol vanished entirely, replaced by an icy, absolute stillness. Sol knew he had to eliminate both threats instantly before they could signal the main garrison outside. He softly told Melo to close her eyes and count backward from 10. The frightened girl quickly squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face into her hands as she began to whisper the numbers. The lead demon lunged forward, thrusting his jagged spear straight towards Sol's chest with lethal force. Sol did not even draw a sword, instead catching the heavy iron spear blade barehanded with absolute ease. The demon's eyes widened in sheer disbelief, as his unstoppable momentum was halted instantly by a mere human. With a slight twist of his wrist, Sol shattered the heavy iron weapon into 100 flying shards. Before the fragments could hit the floor, Sol moved like a ghost, reappearing directly behind the commander. He drove 2 fingers straight through the back of the demon's heavy iron armor, piercing his core. The commander collapsed instantly without making a single sound, his demonic life force completely extinguished. The second demon soldier turned to flee, screaming in terror as he scrambled toward the open doorway. Sol flicked a single metal gear from his workbench with the speed of a supersonic railgun. The small gear tore through the fleeing demon's neck, killing him instantly before he could reach the street. Sol immediately activated a hidden spatial spell, causing both demonic corpses to dissolve into harmless purple ash. He quickly adjusted his clothes, picked up his hammer, and exhaled a long, steady breath to restore his normal appearance. Sol walked over to Melo just as she finished counting, gently patting her head to reassure her. The girl looked around the clean, empty shop, completely unaware that a lethal execution had just occurred. Sol knew this was only the beginning, as the missing patrol would soon trigger an investigation from higher authorities. Far away in the regional capital, a sharp-eyed official in a pristine military uniform signed a mobilization order. Special Auditor Claude had just been assigned to investigate the anomalies in Oakhaven, threatening to dismantle Sol's peaceful sanctuary forever. The iron-rimmed wheels of the military carriage ground heavily against the jagged gravel path leading into the quiet town of Oakhaven. Inside the dark compartment, Special Auditor Claude adjusted his immaculate white uniform gloves with slow, methodical precision. He held a thick parchment dossier containing the bizarre reports of an entire demonic patrol squad vanishing without a single trace of residual mana. Such an instantaneous erasure of trained combatants suggested the presence of an unregistered, high-level threat lurking within the borderlands. Meanwhile, at the edge of the market district, Sol stood outside his cluttered junk shop, sweeping dust off the weathered wooden porch. Little Melo ran out from the kitchen doors, holding a slightly burnt but freshly baked piece of honey bread proudly above her head. Sol looked down at the young girl, his fierce, war-torn expression softening into that of a genuinely fond, everyday guardian. He patted her small head gently, consciously hiding the deep scars on his knuckles from his decades spent on the front lines. Suddenly, a loud, discordant bugle horn echoed from the town square, instantly breaking the peaceful morning atmosphere. Sol's posture stiffened immediately, his deep-seated combat instincts recognizing the specific fanfare of a high-ranking Imperial official. He gently nudged Melo back inside the house, instructing her to stay hidden in the cellar until he returned from checking the commotion. Melo nodded submissively, sensing the sudden, heavy gravity in her foster father's voice despite her absolute innocence. Sol pulled a worn, faded cloth apron over his clothes, assuming his carefully constructed identity as a humble, insignificant townsman. In the central plaza, a crowd of fearful local merchants had already gathered around the sleek, dark military carriage. The carriage door swung open, and Claude stepped down onto the cobblestones, his polished black boots clicking sharply against the rock. Two heavily armed guard demons flanked him immediately, their massive halberds gleaming menacingly under the dull sky. Claude scanned the crowd with a chillingly analytical gaze, looking for any signs of deception or hidden combat proficiency among the peasants. Sol slipped effortlessly into the back rows of the crowd, slouching his shoulders and keeping his gaze cast firmly toward the damp ground. Claude stepped forward and unrolled an official imperial decree, his clear voice cutting effortlessly through the low murmurs of the townsfolk. He announced that a full investigation was underway regarding the mysterious disappearance of the 3rd Eastern Vanguard Patrol Squad. Sol listened quietly, his internal mind calculating the exact trajectory of Claude's impending investigation with cold, tactical precision. Claude declared that every single household in Oakhaven would be thoroughly searched for unauthorized magical artifacts or hidden resistance cells. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the oppressive nature of a martial law search threatened their fragile livelihoods. Sol felt a sudden surge of genuine adrenaline, realizing that a thorough magical sweep would instantly detect the dormant, high-tier hero mana inside Melo. He knew he needed to create a convincing diversion to draw the auditor's immediate attention away from the residential sectors. Reaching into his pocket, Sol extracted a tiny, ancient mechanical core that he had salvaged from the battlefield a decade ago. With a subtle flick of his wrist, he channeled a microscopic spark of his massive aura into the device, overloading its containment field. He tossed the unstable core deep into an abandoned warehouse located on the exact opposite side of the industrial district. A massive, echoing magical explosion violently rocked the far end of the town, blowing out old glass windows and sending a plume of thick smoke into the sky. Claude turned his head instantly toward the blast, his sharp analytical instincts immediately registering the high-density mana resonance. Believing he had just located the hidden nest of the mysterious rebel force, Claude ordered his elite guards to advance on the warehouse at full speed. The frantic crowd scattered in all directions, successfully clearing the plaza and buying Sol the vital time he desperately needed. Sol moved swiftly through the back streets, his expression turning grave as he realized this distraction was only a temporary solution. He burst through the back door of his junk shop, finding Melo huddled fearfully beneath the heavy oak kitchen table. He scooped her up into his powerful arms, whispering soothing words to calm her erratic, dangerously fluctuating spiritual energy. Meanwhile, at the ruined warehouse, Claude examined the glowing residual fragments of the exploded core with growing fascination. He realized the advanced military craftsmanship of the device belonged exclusively to the legendary Vanguard army from 10 years ago. Standing up, he ordered his scouts to immediately map out every single repair shop and blacksmith capable of handling such ancient tech. The tactical crosshairs of the entire Imperial investigation were now shifting directly towards Sol's small domestic sanctuary. Back at the shop, Sol stood by the window, watching the distant shadows of approaching patrol guards as a heavy, inescapable doom settled over the house. The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets like a suffocating gray shroud. Heavy iron-shod boots crunched rhythmically against the wet stone as a new battalion arrived. At the head of the column rode Colonel Ballum, a man whose presence felt like a physical weight upon the air. His eyes were cold as chips of flint, scanning the humble buildings for any sign of resistance. Beside him rode Vine, his daughter, who kept her nose tilted upward as if catching a faint aroma in the wind. From the shadows of his repair shop, Sol watched the procession with a narrowing gaze. He recognized the crest on their banners immediately as the mark of the Chimera Corps. Little Melo tugged at his sleeve, her eyes wide with an instinctive dread she couldn't explain. Sol placed a calloused hand on her head, silently urging her to step back into the kitchen. Outside, Vine signaled the column to halt exactly 3 blocks away from the shop. Balam looked down at his daughter, noting the way her pupils had dilated with excitement. She whispered that the scent of the legendary hero was faint, but undeniably present in this very air. Sol felt a chill crawl down his spine as he realized they weren't just patrolling for demons. He remembered Balam from the war, a man who fed his enemies to bio-engineered nightmares. Sol quickly began stashing his more advanced mechanical tools beneath the floorboards. He told Melo to stay in the cellar and not to make a single sound regardless of what she heard. The young girl nodded tearfully, disappearing into the darkness of the lower level. Sol took a deep breath, suppressing his massive aura until he appeared as nothing more than a common laborer. A sudden, violent kick shattered the shop's front door, sending splinters flying into the room. 2 soldiers entered first, their spears leveled at Sol's chest with lethal intent. Sol raised his hands in mock terror, putting on the performance of a lifetime. Balam stepped through the ruined doorway, his massive frame barely fitting through the frame. He looked around the messy workshop with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Vine followed him in, her eyes darting around like a predator hunting for a hidden nest. Balam asked Sol why a simple repairman would be hiding when the Imperial army arrives to protect him. Sol stuttered an excuse about being startled by the sudden noise of the breaking door. Vine picked up a small, hand-carved wooden doll that Melo had left on the table. She noted that the toy still held the lingering warmth of a child's touch. Balam ordered his men to tear the place apart, to find the stray his daughter had sensed. Soldiers began smashing jars and flipping tables, searching for any hidden crawlspaces. Sol felt his heart hammering against his ribs, not out of fear for himself, but for Melo. His fingers twitched, ready to snap the neck of the nearest soldier in less than a second. Vine walked slowly toward the cellar door, her boots clicking like a death knell. She paused right on top of the trapdoor, tapping the wood with the toe of her boot. Sol realized he had to create a distraction before she decided to open it. He intentionally knocked over a heavy pile of metal pipes, creating a deafening crash in the opposite corner. The soldiers jumped, drawing their swords as they spun toward the source of the noise. Balam barked at Sol to stay still or face immediate execution for his clumsiness. Vine didn't move, her eyes remaining fixed on the gaps in the floorboards beneath her feet. She knelt down, her fingers tracing the edge of the hidden latch with terrifying precision. In that moment, a low, guttural growl echoed from outside the shop, stopping everyone in their tracks. A massive chimera, escaped from its transport cage, loomed in the street like a nightmare made flesh. Balam swore loudly, realizing his men had lost control of the biological weapon. The beast lunged, its claws shredding the wooden exterior of the shop as it tried to force its way in. Sol saw his opening, his eyes flashing with a spark of his true, dormant power. Vine looked back at him, her eyes widening as she felt the sudden massive shift in the atmosphere. Before she could speak, the roof of the shop began to groan under the weight of the attacking monster. Just as Vine's hand gripped the cellar handle, a massive claw crashed through the ceiling right between her and Sol. As the building began to collapse, Sol reached into the debris for a weapon, his secret identity hanging by a single thread. Beneath the floor, Melo screamed, and the sound drew the attention of both the monster and the girl who hunted heroes. The muffled scream echoing from beneath the floorboards galvanized Sol into immediate, terrifying action. Vine spun around toward the hidden hatch, her predatory eyes locking onto the origin of the sound. Before the demon girl could take a step, Sol vanished from his position with a deafening sonic boom. Sol reappeared directly in front of Vine, his outstretched hand clamping onto her face with crushing force. The chimera beast behind her roared in defiance, but Sol merely cast a freezing sidelong glance toward the monstrosity. With a precise flick of his wrist, a dense shockwave of localized gravity pinned the massive beast flat against the wall. Down in the hidden basement cellar, Melo held her breath while clinging tightly to her father's old worn coat. Sol realized the local sanctuary was compromised, meaning he had to strike directly at the viper's nest immediately. He whispered a soft, magically infused reassurance through the floorboards to lull Melo into a deep, protective sleep. Leaving the subdued intruders bound in specialized suppression barriers, Sol stepped out into the crimson twilight. Meanwhile, at the heavily fortified regional demon headquarters, Colonel Balam reviewed his tactical deployment maps. He smiled grimly, fully confident that his daughter Vine would return shortly with the prize he sought. Suddenly, the massive steel blast doors of the command facility began to groan under immense external pressure. Demon guards scrambled to raise their energy spears as the structural alarms began to wail across the complex. With a deafening explosion of metal, the blast doors shattered into 1,000 lethal shards that tore through the front ranks. Through the thick smoke walked a single, unhurried figure shrouded in a dark cloak. Colonel Balam stepped onto the high balcony overlooking the hall, his voice booming with absolute rage. Sol raised his head slightly, his calm voice cutting through the ringing alarms with effortless clarity. Balam laughed aloud, ordering his elite Chimera vanguard to tear the arrogant human infiltrator to pieces. 5 massive, biological Chimera horrors leaped from the shadows, their claws dripping with corrosive acid. Sol did not even draw a weapon, merely releasing a fraction of his true vanguard aura into the chamber. The sheer atmospheric pressure of the aura forced the leaping monsters downward, smashing them into the stone floor instantly. Balam's smile vanished as he recognized the distinct, legendary energy frequency from the war a decade ago. Sol stepped forward, and with each footstep, the massive obsidian columns of the fortress cracked and shattered. Desperate, Balam activated his personal cybernetic armor enhancements, his mechanical limbs glowing with volatile plasma. The colonel unleashed a massive torrent of plasma fire directly at the advancing swordsman. Sol merely raised a single hand, catching the apocalyptic energy beam in his bare palm without moving an inch. With a simple squeeze of his fist, Sol crushed the remnants of the energy beam into complete nothingness. In the blink of an eye, Sol appeared directly on the high balcony, standing mere inches away from the trembling colonel. Sol reached out and effortlessly tore the heavy plasma cannons clean off Balam's armor, tossing them over the edge. Balam tried to swing a heavy cybernetic fist, but Sol intercepted the strike, crushing the metal hand into scrap. Sol forced the massive commander down onto his knees with a single downward push against his shoulder. The legendary swordsman leaned in close, his voice a low whisper that carried the weight of an entire fallen era. He demanded an absolute, immediate withdrawal of all military presence from the outer border regions. Sol made it clear that any further investigation into the town or the children would result in the complete annihilation of the capital. Balam nodded frantically, his pride entirely shattered by the realization that humanity's greatest weapon was still alive. With the tactical truce forcefully secured, Sol turned away, his aura receding back into his body like a retracting tide. Special Auditor Claude watched from the hidden upper monitoring room, recording the entire encounter with a complex magical device. Claude realized that while the capital would remain quiet for now, the true chess game for the future of the kingdom had only just begun. Sol walked back through the ruined front gates, knowing he had bought his family precious years of peace. By the time the sun began to rise, he had returned to the junk shop, finding the house perfectly safe and undisturbed. Melo ran up from the cellar hatch, her face lighting up with absolute happiness as she threw her arms around him. The legendary right-hand swordsman smiled softly, content to remain an ordinary repairman as long as his daughter could smile.